Hello and welcome to today's guest, the wonderful, wonderful Janice Thompson, who I have had the privilege and honor of doing a training course with. Janice is an EFT, matrix reimprint, master practitioner and trainer. She is also, I think, one of the world experts on grief. And we're all suffering from grief at the moment. And I'd like to bring Janice on to say hello. Hi, Janice. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, hi, Philly. Thank you for inviting me on a topic that's so important. It's absolutely crucial. And, I've spent a lot of time researching as a researcher. That was my background. So I spent a lot of time researching, understanding about grief and loss and death, as well as working with thousands of clients now and my own personal journey as well. So
I know. And I ended up, I'm going to tell the story of how we met, actually, Janice, because I've been through a lot of grief in my life. Over a very short period of time, I lost my mum, my sister, and my two closest friends. And I had dealt with that through EFT and matrix reimprint. But then in October of 2019, I met a very beautiful man, because my marriage had fallen to pieces a year earlier, and I met a very beautiful man on Tinder and fell head over heels. And then on the 19th of December 2019, he sent me reams and reams of messages that he loved me and that he couldn't imagine his life without me, and that I enriched his life and he wanted to do the same for me. And then the next day he stopped reading my messages, and I thought he regretted everything he said and had ghosted me. And on New Year's Eve that year, I discovered on his Facebook page that he had actually gone to sleep that night, had a massive heart attack, and died. And the shock was tremendous. And then popped up in my emails an email from Janice saying that she was doing a training course for EFT practitioners, which I won, on grief. And I'm like, I've got to do this. And so I wasn't really there as a trainer. I was there for Janice to help me. And what we achieved, what you achieved with me on that 3-day course, Janice, I really don't know how I could have got through the early part of 2020. Little did I know that we were going to have a whole lot of 2020 to get through, which we'll come to later. But you really are extraordinary. And I'd like you to share with the audience why your story, what happened to you, which is equally, if not more shocking, far more shocking.
Oh, no, I don't know about shocking, because everyone's grief is so individual. That's the other thing that's so important. It's so unique. We don't all grieve the same, because we don't come into grief as a blank slate. We come into grief with our life up until that point. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But yes, and it was lovely to meet you on that course. And, it's all about facilitating. It's all about holding space for people and helping them to maneuver through their grief and integrate into their lives themselves, really. But hopefully, I help along that way. But yeah, I mean, the reason I come into work in what I do with the grief is because I was a personal trainer and had a really successful personal training business. And it was all a lovely evening with my two daughters. My husband had recently transferred to London, up to where we were living in mid Wales, and he'd only been there a couple of months. And I'd really thought, this is it, great, everything's going to be, finally, we're all together, everything's going to be good. And one night I'd been to an aerobics class that I taught and come back, made dinner, and my little daughter come running in saying, oh, Daddy's collapsed. I thought he was playing around, as he always does. But of course, as soon as I got out there, I realized it's much more serious. And really the long and the short of it is that the medical profession come around for a long while and tried to resuscitate him, but he'd had a massive heart attack and died there and then. So again, it was that sudden shock, which is an enormous impact on you. And what I didn't realize at the time was I'd also lost my father. I did realize this at the time. I'd also lost my father when I was 14. But what I didn't realize, I'd never really dealt with that. So what happened after my husband died, I had this real, like double double grief come over me, which now we know is complicated grief or chronic grief. There's a few different names for it, but it's where you hadn't resolved something that is then re-triggered. And so it was a massive impact on me. And I spent so long trying to look after my children, which was really, really difficult, keep myself together, you know, just try and keep everything going, and find ways to help myself. And really, when I found energy techniques is when I started to really heal. So Reiki was brilliant, absolutely marvelous. Reiki was really, really good, helpful. But when I found Carl Dawson, I do believe you may be speaking to him at some point. He was an amazing guy, amazing EFT master, and I learned so much, and I just could feel things healing. I just really begun a healing process that I should have started when I was 14, that I didn't. And, you know, subsequently, I've lost my mother, who I cared for and helped her, and she was in a home, which we perhaps talk about a little bit later as well. And those losses have subsequently been not easier, but different, and more of a natural flow about them because of the tapping and the EFT and the matrix work. So, you know, that's how I got into doing what I'm doing. So it's with an absolute passion that I work with grief and get people talking about death. I am so passionate about it, Philly, you would not believe. And that's why I do what I do. I'm driven.
I know. I've been lucky enough to have your guidance, and your passion is remarkable. But not only that, you're one of very few people in the world that talk about grief. You know, nobody talks about it. You know, and I'd like to I write in my book that, you know, grief isn't just losing somebody when they die. It's also, you know, maybe losing a job, losing a house, losing a business, an education, and a childhood, you know, and we've seen a tremendous amount of grief over the last 2.5 years. But you're an inspiration for where you've come on your journey. So first of all, could you tell the audience what EFT is, please?
Okay. Well, EFT stands for Emotional Freedom Techniques, which is the best way we will describe it is it's like acupuncture without needles. So we use specific acupressure points on the body that we tap on, instead of putting a needle in, which is quite good for me because I'm not always great with needles. So there's certain points on the body that we tap on that are simple and easy to do. And those points are actually near to the surface of the skin. And that's why the tapping works with those specific points that we pick on these meridian lines that we have. You may have seen like the charts with Chinese medicine. And we tap on that. But at the same time, we're using our cognitive abilities to talk through and try and understand what's going on and work through emotions that are there. We're never taught to look at emotions. We're never taught that they are really important aspects of our being, which they are, and they're a great guidance system. You know, if we don't feel happy, it's because we're sad, there's something wrong. If we're really happy, it's because things are going well. So they're a brilliant guidance system, and the tapping can really help, particularly with grief, when there's so much sadness and pain and all those massive amount of emotions that are there. It helps unblock our energy system and bring things from the subconscious mind up into the conscious mind so that we can work with them and deal with them. Because as I know, you know, our subconscious is the part of us that's running our whole show. 90% of what we're doing in our day is run by our subconscious. Our 10% conscious mind is great for getting us places and all the rest of it. But those subconscious patterns that we develop are what's running our show. And that's how also, you know, that complicated grief, which again, I'll talk about in a minute, can really sort of show up, because it will come up from some subconscious of something that happened perhaps way back when, that is having an effect on your grief as well now. So often grief isn't just about that loss that someone's experienced in that moment in time, but often it's related to other traumas and shocks and other things that have gone in people's lives.
And the triggers come up for those when you least expect them. I mean, when my granny was dying, she had my bedroom at home. And my mum grew some freesias in the greenhouse, and every day after school I had to go and cut them and bring them in because they smelt beautiful. But I didn't realize until I did the course with you that every time I smelt that beautiful smell of the freesia, it triggered going back to taking in and basically watching my granny die. So, if you could maybe talk a little bit more about that, all these triggers around us that.
Yeah. And that's really important, actually. There's so many triggers, because it's almost like when we have a shock, and there's normally a shock element in loss and grief. There's normally some sort of shock at some point. And when we have that shock, it's like our whole being takes a big photograph of what's happened in that moment, which all goes into our subconscious. So if I'm eating an apple and I hear something terrible's happened, maybe when I eat that apple again, it reminds me of that, and not consciously reminds me, but I suddenly eat it and then go, oh God, thinking about that thing that happened again, so there's so many, and we don't know, because you think of in a split moment, what you can see, hear, smell and taste in one moment around you is enormous amounts. So there's always a lot of triggers. So what I think is helpful for people, particularly with grief, is things don't come from nowhere. So if you feel something, it's not just come out of nowhere, which can appear frightening, because where's that thought come from? Why am I feeling this? These thoughts and feelings do not come from nowhere. You've probably been triggered by something. If it's, more of a negative emotion, then you've probably been triggered by something in your environment, and you may or may not find out what that is. But as you know, the EFT will certainly help to help you become aware of things that you're not aware of within your own self, and you learn so much about yourself. You learn so much about yourself.
It is such a journey, and the other thing I love about it is you can do it on your own, and it's free.
Yeah, absolutely. No side effects.
No side effects. Yes.
No side effects. And for grief particularly, Philly, what is really helpful is that you feel a little bit more in control, because often with grief, there's a feeling of out of control because something's happened and it just happened. So actually, when you get these emotions and you can use the tapping for yourself, you can actually just take the edge off of feelings and think, wow, I've got a little bit more control of what's going on. So that's another really positive aspect about the tapping.
Yeah, no, we work on a SUDS level from 0 to 10, and you can feel this emotion in your body coming up. And if you start with a SUDS level 8 and you even just get it down to 4, you've halved the problem. But the more work you do on it, the better, easier it becomes. It's a phenomenal technique.
So simple. And that's the other thing. So many people think it's simple, it can't help with this terrible loss of experience. That's just a misnomer in the world. Just because it's simple doesn't mean so it's highly effective. Most of the simple things in the world are the most highly effective. So if you find yourself thinking it's too simple, it won't help me, then tap on that. But, tap on anything.
Absolutely. People do tapping without realizing it. You find yourself just kind of, if you're agitated, just kind of tapping your foot or kind of doing your fingers on the desk. And it's the body just trying to shift that really, that energy out of you. And if you don't deal with energy, and we've only really recognized for the last 50 years that we have emotions.
Absolutely.
And if you don't deal with it, what happens to it in the body?
Yeah, it's almost, I think the best way to describe it, almost like get stuck. There is a discussion on whether it's stuck in the body or whether it's stuck in the field, out there in the ether sort of thing, or whether it's stuck in the body. But either way, often these emotions that get stuck I see the reflection of that. Clients come to me years after a loss and are still suffering, like 20, 30, 40, 50 years after they've experienced a loss. Now, grief is a process to maneuver through. It shouldn't be something we're stuck in. So if somebody gets stuck, it's these emotions, these feelings, these thoughts, and perhaps developing a belief out of those things as well that get stuck within the body or within the field that we tune back into. So the consequences of that are definitely can be things like depression, anxiety, as well as physical things.
Absolutely. Could you just explain what a belief is and where it sits in your body, how it affects you in your subconscious mind, your beliefs, they're normally limiting beliefs. So if you could just explain that to us, that would be lovely.
And perhaps sort of in the context of grief, particularly with that, is that, if we have a shock, we'll often form a belief from that shock, which is a sort of survival technique. So one of mine was, because of what happened to my husband when he died, I just got really happy that we're all back together again. So out of my losing my husband, I formed a belief that every time something good happens, something bad's going to happen. Yeah. So therefore, now if you take that along someone's life, then I'm avoiding doing things that make me happy, because I believe that if I do make myself happy, then something bad's going to happen. But ultimately, it's not good, because I'm not doing anything that I'm enjoying, because I'm worried about something that could happen that doesn't, but purely because it's a belief that I've developed from that shock.
Yeah, I don't talk much about matrix reimprinting, or I haven't to date. So I'm really glad you brought it up, because it is phenomenal. Because you do need a practitioner for it, don't you? You can't, it's not something you can do on your own. No. And I've very much been focused on bringing people free resources that they can learn. However, Absolutely. There are a lot of people suffering from grief at the moment. And at the end, we will give out your webpage, and we'll put it in the show notes. But can you just explain what matrix reimprinting is, please?
Yeah, just really briefly. I mean, you can do it on your own, but I think with big traumas and griefs and losses, it's probably better to work with a practitioner. But the EFT you can certainly use on your own. But matrix reimprinting is really sort of going back to the point where that trauma happened. So for me, when I was 14, when my dad died, I'd go back and actually sort of tap on that 14-year-old, almost in a imaginary, seeing that 14-year-old there, and tap on her at the source. And what's great about that is you sort of realize things that perhaps you didn't realize as the older woman that I am now about how I felt then. And you can really clear at the source, really. But also the beautiful part about Matrix for Grief is that we can actually do things we didn't do, say things that we didn't say. And that's really helpful for grief, because there's so many times in loss people say, oh, I regret I never said this, or I regret I never did this. So I think that's why it is worth mentioning here for people watching, because that aspect of matrix reimprinting can be really, really helpful, because we sort of set the scene and we just shift and move some things around, and people get the chance to say and do things perhaps they didn't.
I know. We both have worked with the wonderful Penny Kroll as well. And after my friend died, we went out to the Matrix, and I just sat with him on a beach and said a goodbye. I don't know whether it would have ever lasted or not, but when you get that shock, the shock puts up so many barriers to anything that you feel, and you just can't cope. So just to go and say goodbye to somebody is just wonderful. Comes back to the limiting beliefs a little bit. Your daughter was with her dad when he collapsed, and so she must have had terrible beliefs coming up about being powerless.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, and she did. And, her grieving was very different from my elder daughter, because the younger daughter was the one that was with my husband when he died, and she was 8. My older daughter was 14, and she was around, but she wasn't actually with him. And yes, they both had different sort of beliefs around that. And it's taken a while, because at first my daughter didn't really want to do any tapping and that, because sometimes that happens. And
I was going to ask you that, actually. How did you get your children tapping? Because I cannot get my children tapping.
Do you know, actually, the funny thing about it was I did. And, one of my daughters had vitiligo. Well, that's what it was diagnosed at. After my husband died, it come up, this patch of different colour skin, and that's what it was diagnosed as. And the doctor said, just what will happen. And we did some tapping, and that's really, I know perhaps you're going to be talking about some meta health meta consciousness stuff with Penny Crowell, the great Penny Crowell as well. But that can often be around things like really brutal separation. And when we did some tapping around that specific sort of title, it cleared and went completely. I work with individual clients, but as you know, you come on the training, I work to help trainers to understand grief more, so they're more confident in talking about grief and what happens. And that's one of the first things that I'll always say: don't compare grief. Everyone's grief is individual and it's really important to them, so really move away. Don't start making any judgments on, you know, everybody's grief, everybody's loss, whatever the loss is. And as you said, there can be millions of different types of losses. Every loss is individual and important to that person, and that's really important to be respected.
The fear, you know, I say this a lot, fear is the biggest suppressor of the immune system. And, you know, the last 2.5 years, we have been plunged into a lot of fear and a lot of grief. And again, grief is incredibly low on the energy vibrational scale that Dr. David Hawkins did in his book Power versus Force. And I actually have on the back of my book, because it's very important to know about this energy vibrational scale. So I wonder if you would like to talk a little bit about the last 2.5 years, what you feel is kind of going on collectively with this just endless fear.
And I'll start with just preempting this a little bit as well, with the fact that there's so many different types of grief. There's lots of different types of grief, and collective grief is one of them. And I think a lot of people have been experiencing that over the last couple of years, because we were all on lockdown. Everybody was frightened because nobody really knew what was going on. There'd be lots of different messages coming out. And then, so that's one fear. And then on top of that, it is about life and death. What we've been hearing, people have had COVID, people are frightened that they're going to get COVID and they're going to die, their loved ones are going to get COVID and die. And in amongst all of this, people have been ill with other illnesses. And I think one of the biggest fears, one of the biggest problems actually that I've encountered, is something called disenfranchised grief. And disenfranchised grief is where you can't really, or some groups, or you can't really acknowledge a loss. Now, if you think about what happened within COVID and funerals, so where people did lose somebody by death in COVID, whether it was COVID or any other cause of death, they weren't allowed to go to the funerals, or there'd only be a few. It wouldn't be the normal rituals we do. We've had rituals for centuries and centuries. There's a reason for that. They help us.
Absolutely.
So the fact that we couldn't has caused another layer of problems where we feel we couldn't, people were like, oh, somebody died of something and it wasn't COVID. Well, I don't feel I should talk about that. There's been layer upon layer upon layer of grief over the last couple of years, layer upon layer of fear. And people have been taught to be really fearful of death. And there's so much in media and different outlets of how many have died this week, how many. I've not seen anything on general media on how to help yourself, help your anxieties. It's all about this is how many people have died, this is how the NHS are really struggling. Oh no, so if I'm going to be ill, I'm not even going to get treated now. There's so many fears on top of fears, and ultimately they almost all come down to this fear of death, that it's a cultural thing, mainly in Western society, and I am generalizing, our fear of death. There's a lot of cultures that totally celebrate death as what I sort of come to believe is this transitionary space. It's not this end, that's it, that's we're alive and dead, and what's that mean, or it might mean we go to hell or something. There's been layer upon layer of these fears around death that have made it really difficult for people to deal with what's going on. Because if you're in so much fear, as I know you speak about, if one's in so much fear, you can't think clearly. You can't go about your life. Your whole system's almost clogging up. And fear of death has been a massive one that for a long period of time has almost been drip fed that it's something to be really scared of.
Yeah, no, that's very true. And I think that, I mean, for me, I have no fear of death anymore. And that's because of you, Janice. I mean, I did have a fear of death until I worked with you. And now I don't have a fear. And if you fear death, if you live in fear of death, and I think that's the difference. The last 2 years, it wasn't just fear of death. People were living, complete fear of death. Nothing, life didn't matter. But if you live in fear of death, you cannot enjoy your life. You cannot live your life. Coming back to your limiting belief, if something really good happens, then something bad's going to happen. And, everybody, I think it's been a tragic moment in history.
From what I've seen with the research with near-death experiences and when people are just about to pass the research, I've looked at that where, there's so many similar stories. And, there are the exceptions I've worked with where people have said, oh, I had a near-death experience and it was really horrendous. When we actually worked it with it, that was something else going on. That was another belief. Yes, that's what I can say about that. So people have thought, well, I didn't want to tell you about my near death because it was terrible, and everyone else's seems to be light and family and that. But when we've actually sort of drilled down with our tapping and really got to the crux of what's going on, there's been something else that's been going on that's actually made them believe that that's what's going to happen. So that, I think, is an interesting thing to hear as well.
Yeah, and I worked with somebody once who didn't realize that he'd had a near-death experience, but he didn't have a very good relationship with his mother. And we worked through and we tapped and we did matrix, and I took him back to his childhood. And he remembered this near-death experience, and he had pulled boiling water off the stove. And then he was put in a bath and his heartbeat was lost. And all he remembered was his mother shouting at him, "You stupid boy." And so he had got this limiting belief that he was a stupid boy. And I think people don't realize that how they talk to each other. And I'm sure that was just sheer panic from the mother, just panic. But once you start clearing all of that stuff, then, you can get over grief. So, we were working, I suppose, with the grief that he didn't have a relationship with his mom, and that's grief.
Yeah, absolutely it is. Absolutely. And, another grief is the life one thought one was going to have. That's another loss. I thought I was going to be living in this house with my husband, and kids are going to grow up. And so there's also that loss of what one thinks one expected to happen as well. That can be another really important loss for people.
Yeah, I think it's important to, we live in the here and now, and we forget that. And everything that happened behind us is our memory, but everything that happens in front is just our imagination.
Absolutely.
And, we're not good anymore at living in the here and now. We don't have those connections with nature and our environment and everything that always brought us back to center, if you like.
Absolutely. And nature's renowned help for a healer with grief. Just being in nature, just being out in nature. It's another thing people can do. Just go out in nature and be a bit mindful, listen to the birds, look at the trees.
Hug a tree.
Hug a tree.
Hug a tree.
Absolutely.
If we all do it, we won't look mad.
No, that's right. That's it. Yeah. Same with the tapping, isn't it? When we first start tapping, we think it's a bit of a, what are we doing? But now you just do it all the time because you know how much it helps.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even notice when I do it. And I can be sitting there with my children, and I have a comfort point here on the collarbone, and I can just start tapping, and my girls just look at me and go, "What's triggering you, Mum?" And I go, "Oh, I was," and nothing's triggered me, but I had just thought of something that had gone back to something that was a trigger. And so I just kind of go, but I still can't get my children doing it.
No.
It does look as mad as shit.
Oh, bless them. In recent times, grief a complicated grief, which is like perhaps what I had, you know, and a lot of my clients, a lot of people have got, because they've got grief on top of other griefs or grief on top of other traumas, has been looked at by the medical profession as a disorder. So I would just like to mention this, because, you know, if you're somebody who's been really grieving and perhaps you go along to the doctor and they said you've got prolonged bereavement disorder, then it's just, it's something I'd just like to say, that actually that's going to be really helpful for you in terms of perhaps getting the help you need from the medical profession. But in terms of working from an EFT point of view, it is that complicated grief. It's grief on top of another grief. So don't be afraid if you've gone to a doctor and they're saying you've got prolonged grief, you know, prolonged bereavement disorder, or complex bereavement disorder. In America, I think it's slightly different names in Britain compared to America and other places. So don't be afraid if you've got that label. Allow it to help you to help yourself. And grieving is a natural process. Yeah, if you're born, you're going to die at some point, and grieving is a natural process that we'll all go through at some point in our lives. And it's just how can we maneuver our way through that best of all. And you know, the other part of that also is that actually on a further down the road side of that, you can actually use that grief to really shift and change your life. You know, I have clients that, oh, I've got to get over my grief, or at least just come to some sort of place that, oh, it's okay. Well, actually, you can use it to really, when it's the appropriate point in your grieving process, but to really expand and develop dreams that you have that you never fulfilled, or honoring that person that died. I know one client that started doing lots of walks that their father had done, and they just had this sense of connection and fitness and out in nature by doing those walks that their father had done. So it was a way of honoring and respecting that person that had died. So honoring that person in such a beautiful way, but actually also improving your own being. I would not have become the spiritual being that I feel I've become and I'm always developing if what hadn't happened to me. So it's not, of course I'd rather my husband be here, but I can see the transformation that has enabled me to happen. I think if people can see that, obviously not in the rawness of grief, but at some point, then that's a really important part too.
I think it's really important to remember that things happen for you, not to you.
Absolutely.
And once you take the victim out, you stop, you know, because we very often with grief see ourselves as a victim. Actually, could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's part of that whole suffering, you know, where we think that if, you know, we're a victim, it's why has this happened to me? You know, things happen, and they do happen. And it's almost, of course it's personal, but it's almost not in some respects as well. You know, it's the suffering that we're almost trained into, you know, feeling guilty. If you're not suffering still in that pain years later, then you really haven't respected that person. That's not the case.
Is there another technique? I mean, do you think the movie technique would help as much as the Matrix? Could you explain the movie technique to us?
Yeah. I mean, should we just, I mean, the movie technique really is almost like just breaking down something that's happened to you into short little pieces where you can actually talk through it and tap. So really, even just talking and tapping, so where we tap and just talk about what's happened is really helpful. The next thing that you could perhaps do is just actually talk through, perhaps you walked into the room and this happened and that happened, and then perhaps if you feel like that made me feel really sad, we stop and do big full rounds of tapping, because that sadness emotion we want to bring down a bit, and then we carry on that little movie, so to speak, that little bit of a story that you're telling, and then perhaps anger comes in because someone said something, and then we can stop and tap around the anger, and we do that for that whole little, what we call a movie, which is broken down. So you could have a couple of movies if it's a long event that happened, but that can be really helpful if there's something that just keeps going over in your mind as well. That oh, did I do that? Why did I do that? Why did I do that? So you can actually say, you know, I'm going to call this movie, Why Did I Do That? And then just talk through it. And at any point that you feel emotion or anything feels uncomfortable in your body, even because it can show that way, then we stop and tap. So that can be helpful.
Thank you for explaining that, because, you know, I'm going to come back to COVID a little bit now, and the fact that, you know, we've spoken a little bit about, you know, deaths that happened over that period, but we have a lot of deaths coming up now, people that haven't had treatment that they should have had for the last 2.5 years. You know, we seem to have lots of other things going on. I'm seeing ambulances all the time at the moment, which is slightly alarming. What advice, what help can you give people going forward? How do we go forward from this? How do we get over what has been the most extraordinary grief for all of us? And again, as a collective consciousness, it's a lot more powerful. What do you think we can do to move forward from this?
I mean, I think, you know, using the EFT as and when is a really important thing, because sometimes something just sort of hits us. We see something on the news. I mean, I don't watch the news. I don't read newspapers, you know, because it's just all too fear-provoking. And you know, I know what's going on. I'm not in ignorance. I understand what's going on in the world. You know, I have other sources that I will look at. But I think if you just recognize, number one is acknowledge what you're feeling. I think if you can acknowledge, if you're moving forward and your day is going okay and you've got this done and you've fed the kids and you've done this and done that, and then you hear something or see something and it just brings up that fear again, just acknowledge, okay, I've been frightened again. I've been frightened here. And then we can tap. So we can literally go around the points and do the tapping on. And all you need to say is this fear, all this fear, all this fear. And if you can get it specific, this fear around this news article I've just heard, then do that. Just a couple of rounds. We're taught from day one, if we put any time into our own being, then we're being selfish. We're not thinking of others. But that's not a truth, you know. It's helping, you know, we're here, I'm me, you're you, that we can help ourselves in wonderful ways with these simple tools that are gentle. And even with the biggest traumas, the biggest losses I've worked with, you know, again, it's not a comparison, but where there's been major trauma or major genocides and things like that, when you're working in those sort of areas, people can actually come to peace and feel really different within themselves, and that is enormous, absolutely enormous.
Yeah, absolutely.
With simple techniques. So remember, it's about you tap in with what you're feeling. So just all you have to do is say what you're feeling and tap. But one thing we probably all got in common is the pain, the emotional pain of loss and the physical pain. So we could just do a round on that. Yeah,
brilliant.
So if we start here, I won't go into great explanations because it'd be nice just to focus on what we're doing. You can find this information on my website, and Philly, I'm sure, has got lots of information on this. So just tapping on the pain, the emotional pain of my loss. Yeah. The emotional pain of my loss, and then take it to the top of your head. So just tapping on the top of your head. This emotional pain of my loss, or physical pain. All this emotional pain to your eyebrow, just on the inner eyebrow there. This emotional pain or physical pain I'm experiencing from my loss. On the side of your eye, just tap. This emotional and physical pain I'm experiencing from my loss. And there may be a particular thing that comes up for you, a particular, how you see that pain, that sadness, that heartbreak, whatever it is. And you can always just use your own words. It's the most important thing. But this is just perhaps to get you going. And under your nose, this emotional pain, this physical pain of my loss. And then we can even bring it into these fears around loss. Yeah, So these are just examples of what you could do, everybody, okay? Use your own words, do what feels right for you. But these are examples. All these fears around loss, my grief. These fears, this pain. And then under your arm, do just under your arm there. All this pain, this emotional pain, these fears around my loss. And if things are popping up into your head now, you just follow them as well. So if sort of I'm feeling angry at what happened, then you can just carry on tapping with I'm feeling angry. Just follow where you're feeling. Follow your flow and onto your thumb. And then we can almost finish this round with just something a little positive tap in here. I am able to integrate this grief into my life. And the next finger, we do all the fingers. I am able to integrate this grief into my life, even if I can't see how at the moment. And the next finger, I am able to integrate this grief into my life, even if I can't see how at the moment. I am able to integrate this grief into my life, even if I can't see how at the moment. And the little finger, I am able to integrate this grief into my life, even if I can't see how at the moment. Okay. And then just let your hands rest and take a nice couple of deep breaths in and out. And another one. Lovely. And relax. Okay. Just a couple of simple ideas to get you started. Always follow your own feelings, but
yeah,
that
was lovely.
Gives you a bit of an example. Yeah,
that was lovely. And the minute you started re-imprinting on the fingers, I did this massive yawn where what was coming up for me, just that simple technique of just re-imprinting it towards the end and letting it go. And then you can yawn, your body will automatically yawn or fart or
definitely burp.
Yeah,
it does.
Burping.
They're all normal. They're all normal
all
reactions.
normal reactions. So that was absolutely fantastic. So before we go, I would like you to tell everybody where they can find you, Janice. And I know that you have a beautiful gift on your webpage, the 9 what's it called on your the 9
myths
of
grief. It's not on there at the minute because I'm just changing it, so it will be there though. That will be there. It will be there. Just updating it a little bit. But
before we do that, we do that, I've got to tell everybody that you've almost finished. You've finished your book.
Oh my gosh, my book. Anybody who knows me, it's been a long process with lots going on and lots of tapping along the way. But yes, I've been a long while writing my Joy Beyond Grief book, and it's at the publishers at the end of this month. So then it should be a couple of months. So it will be here. I've spent a long time doing it, and it's a book to help you. You know, you can read and learn different aspects and all about the tapping in it. And there's self-love exercises at the end of every chapter, of which there's 12.
Fantastic.
So at the end of each chapter, there's 12. So that's really helpful for you. So that, I've said it for a long while. It's been coming, but it's here.
I know.
I can relax.
Every time I've ever spoken to you or met you or seen you, I go, when's the book coming out? Because I know this book is so needed, Janice. I am so excited to read it. And hopefully you'll come back on the podcast when you launch your book.
Absolutely.
And we can
talk about it.
That again. Definitely. It would be lovely. But until we get your book, where can people find you, my lovely?
Okay, you can find me at www.janicethompson.co.uk. And you email me. My email address and contact details are all on there as well. hello@janicethompson.co.uk as well. But please do get in touch. I'm really happy to speak, and I'm also having a bit of a gathering for anyone who's experienced grief or wants to chat about it or wants to learn a couple of simple techniques to help, on the 31st of August at 6 p.m. till 7:30 p.m. that's UK time. And you can go onto my website, and it's scroll to the bottom of my first page, you'll see it there, and you can tap and come along, and that's free. So come along and just introduce yourself. Let's get talking about death and grief and loss.
Fantastic. And that's online, isn't it?
And that's
Janice?
online.
So anybody can do
anyone
that from anywhere in the world. And what an amazing, bless you for doing that, because that is an amazing opportunity, for anybody who has been suffering. Well, we all suffer grief. We have all suffered grief. And there's no way around it, but there is no better way to learn to deal with it than today's guest, Janice Thompson. Janice, it has just been an absolute honor to have you here, and a pleasure. Thank you so much for the wisdom that you give people, and for talking about this incredibly tough subject that so few people wish to talk about. So really, and for the help you've given me, and I know you give thousands and thousands of other people, from the bottom of my heart. Thank you, Janice Thompson.
Oh, thank you so much. Be kind to yourselves, everyone. Bless you. Thank you for this opportunity. It's been lovely. Thank you, Philly.